Hi everyone, and welcome back to the 16th video for the Basic Bible Study course. In this section, we'll finish looking at the individual genres we see in the New Testament by covering the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation, which is also called the Apocalypse, is unique in all the books of the New Testament. There's no other New Testament book like it. And Revelation is not like any kind of book in our modern culture. For this reason, it seems very foreign and strange to us. And Revelation is a strange book, and so it is easy to misunderstand. For this reason, it's very important to understand the characteristics of Revelation, what kind of a book it is, and what we should expect from it. The book of Revelation is actually a mixture of three kinds of literature. The first is epistle, which we've already covered. Chapters 2 through 3 are a series of 7 letters to 7 churches. And John communicates what Jesus says for a specific occasion and purpose in each of these 7 churches. But the entire book is also a message from God written to the same overall general occasion and purpose in all 7 of the churches. Then the second kind of literature in Revelation is prophecy. Now we'll talk more in depth about prophecy in a future section. But prophecy is basically a message from God to his people addressed to a specific situation in history. And the book of Revelation is God's direct message to the church in the situation it was experiencing. Now, both of these first 2 types of literature, they're fairly easy to understand. It's the third type that often gives people trouble because it is so strange to us. And this third type is typically called apocalyptic. Now, the word apocalypse basically means revelation. Revelation and apocalypse are the same word in different languages. That is, it shows us something that has always been there, but which we could not see until the curtains are pulled back, revealing it to us. It claims to give us a revelation of God's working behind the scenes of history. So apocalyptic is a type of literature that was fairly common in the intertestamental period and at the time of Christ, but is basically non-existent today. So let's talk about the characteristics of apocalyptic literature. First, apocalyptic is an extension of the message of the Old Testament prophets in that it talks about coming of judgment and coming salvation. And it emphasizes what God is doing in the world. However, in apocalyptic generally, the sense was more that God seems to have left history alone, at least for a while, but he will soon break in from outside of history to make everything right. Second, typical apocalyptic writing from that day comes in the form of visions and or dreams given through an angelic mediator. These visions claim to narrate what is happening in the world or what will happen in history. And they reveal the interplay between human history and spiritual reality. In other words, things that happen in history are influenced by spiritual activity behind the scenes. Now, in some of the intertestamental apocalyptic books, this format of vision from God may just be a literary fiction to give them an aura of being supernatural revelation. But in the book of Revelation itself, we can be assured that John was given real visions from God that he was told to communicate to his readers. And these visions were often put in symbolic language, so that it could be subversive in times of persecution. So the symbolism was often a veiled reference to real social and political entities. They don't plainly talk about these realities, but they refer to them by a symbolic code. That is, for instance, they could talk about a king using a symbol without the king being aware that he was being talked about. And this brings us to the third characteristic. Apocalyptic literature sometimes uses fantastic imagery, which represents something real in history. It uses cryptic language, but it uses images that would have made sense to the first reader. Gordon Fee likens it to modern political cartoons. Most people in the United States, when they see an elephant or a donkey represented in a cartoon, they know that it represents a political party. But somebody who is unaware of modern politics in the US, they might be confused and ask, well, what does that have to do with an elephant? Because they don't realize what it is pointing to. So Revelation assumes that the readers are in the know and can recognize or figure out its symbols. And apocalyptic literature is also carefully crafted literature. It often has consistent patterns of organization and symbolic numbers of items. For instance, we see the repeated series of 7 things in Revelation. And this is intentional, and it's part of the way that the author communicates meaning by using numbers and patterns symbolically. And many of the apocalypses from the intertestamental period, they claim to be written by a famous person from the Old Testament, probably in order to make them appear to be ancient prophecy hidden for centuries, which they probably weren't. But the book of Revelation is written by John in John's time, and it clearly says, don't seal this up for the future, it is for now. So the book of Revelation in the New Testament is in the form of a typical apocalypse of the time, but it differs from them in significant ways, so that it is a unique book all on its own. It actually does give a revelation of God's plan and his behind-the-scenes working in all of history. And overall, it is like an epistle and prophecy written to address the real needs of 7 churches in John's time. So, Revelation has a specific historical occasion and purpose. The occasion of Revelation was real and or potential suffering and persecution of Christians. The Roman Empire at this time was getting serious about persecuting the church. If you know the history of the early church, for the first 300 years or so, thousands of Christians were killed by the Roman Empire just for being Christian. And many, many more were persecuted in lesser ways. You know, it began in small ways decades before Revelation was written. But for the readers at this time, persecution was beginning in earnest and would get a lot worse. And that includes both official Roman government persecution and informal social pressure and discrimination against Christians. And worse than that, some Christians in some churches were not doing very well, and therefore they were not prepared for the coming challenges. Many were comfortable or complacent or compromised, and they didn't see the crisis coming. And by the way, throughout history, in different times and places, God's church has often been the victim of persecution. And the purpose of Revelation is to warn the church that difficult times were possible, even inevitable. But not just to warn, but to encourage the church to be strong and faithful, even in difficult times. And to strengthen the church towards faithfulness by giving them an eternal eschatological perspective. To pull back the curtain and show the foundational reality and the certain destiny. You see, the book of Revelation is about the gospel. Jesus has conquered sin and death. He is conquering and will conquer every force of evil. So if Christ is conquering all evil, his people should not be worried about persecution from Caesar or any other evil person or institution. Because God is bigger than Caesar, and God always wins. Even if God's side seems to be losing, that is only temporary. Therefore, get on and stay on the winning side of history, which is always Jesus' side. And that's why Revelation is a very relevant book for today in North America and around the world. Now, one of the biggest questions about the book of Revelation is, what do all these symbols point to? In other words, what event in real-life history is Revelation describing? What is the relation between the visions in Revelation and real historical events? Now, there are four basic categories of views that people have held about the book of Revelation. The first view is usually called the preterist view. That is the view that Revelation describes the history in John's time, the time of the writing of the book of Revelation. Therefore, in this view, all the events described happened at the end of the first century, long ago in our past. Now, the second view is called the historical view. And this view thinks that the book of Revelation describes the major scope of history from the time of John until the end of the world. Therefore, in this view, the events described have been spread out throughout church history, and a few of the events will take place at the very end. Now, the third view is called the futurist view. And as you might expect, this view holds that most of the book of Revelation describes future events that will happen at the very end of this age. Therefore, in this view, Revelation describes future events. Or for those who think that we're now in the last time, claim these events are now in motion. And then the fourth view, which is usually called the idealist view or the spiritualist view. This view holds that Revelation doesn't refer to any particular historical events, but the kind of events that happened in any age. And therefore, in this view, these kind of events have regularly happened throughout history and are possibly happening now, at least in certain respects. So, which of these views is true? And how do we decide? Now, the view that we work with will have a large impact on how we read this book. And there are arguments made for and against each of the four views. But there doesn't seem to be any definitive clue in the book of Revelation itself to help us decide for certain. But I would like to suggest that we start with the preterist view. Because like all scripture, it was written to make sense to the first readers, and we can assume it would be relevant to these first readers in their historical setting. So the intention for the first readers is always the controlling aspect for how we understand the Bible. But at the same time, we can also be open to the futurist view, because some things in Revelation are clearly said to describe the end of this age. And we can be slightly open to the other views, because the truth of Revelation can apply, at least in some way, to any part of history. In other words, I suggest that we're open to applying each of the four views as much as is warranted by an honest, skillful reading of each episode. But primarily, work from the preterist view, working to place the events in John's time, but be open to the possibility of analogous applications in our time and in the future as well. Now, we'll talk more about prophecy and biblical prediction and how that all works when we talk about the Old Testament prophets. But now, let's talk about the tools of the book of Revelation. The first tool is to understand the big picture message and the organization of the entire book. Don't try to figure out the details until you know what the whole picture looks like. Remember, the purpose of this book is not to satisfy your curiosity about world events or to make a little chart and timetable of what's going to happen in the future. But the purpose of this book is to encourage faithfulness to Christ no matter what. And the main message of the book of Revelation is God's sovereign control over every event. Even the bad things that happen to Christians are totally under God's control. And if we stay faithful, it will work out. And one of the keys in this respect is chapters 4 and 5 of the book, which are given for the reader to see and understand that God is awesome beyond comprehension, and his plan for the universe will come to completion. Because not only is he the great creator of everything, but Christ has redeemed humanity and defeated every enemy. There are a number of forces that fight against God and his plan and his people, but they will all fail, and they will fail spectacularly. Revelation gives a glimpse of the multiple ways those forces fight against God and his people, and it shows us that God ultimately always wins. Now, the second tool of Revelation is all the symbolic images. Now, these all refer to something real. They all have a reality that they are symbolizing, something in history or some spiritual reality. And they refer to something that was meant to be understood and recognized by the first readers, something in their thought world. They function like political cartoons or business brand icons. And that is where we need to find the significance of the symbols, in the meaning that they evoked in the first readers. So each symbol has some sort of relation to what is symbolized. I wouldn't use a feather to symbolize something heavy or a blade of grass to symbolize something strong. So the symbols in Revelation have some sort of connection to what it is they symbolize. And sometimes Revelation mixes its metaphors. We see that the lamb is also a lion. That doesn't mean that we should imagine an animal that's half lion, half lamb, but rather we should recognize that the one symbolized combines some of the characteristics of a lamb, such as being a sacrifice, an innocent sacrifice, combines that with the characteristics of a lion, such as being strong and ruling. And that means the symbols are not meant to be visualized. The pictures that you sometimes see attempting to depict Revelation, they're usually unhelpful, and they basically miss the point. The point of the symbol must be taken as a whole, and the significance is not often found in the minute details. Rather, try to understand what reality was symbolized and the point that John is making by using this symbol. By this, I don't mean that you try to figure out the exact identity of the 144,000 people, or exactly which historical event each trumpet references, but rather that you understand the significance, the instruction, and the encouragement John was trying to convey by mentioning each of these things. And that brings us to the third tool, which is John's promises and warnings. Notice how John uses the promises of the visions to entice his readers towards faithfulness to God. Notice also how he uses the warnings of judgment to help keep his readers away from the temptations of compromise. Revelation tells us of the reality of evil opposition to God and his people, and the realistic possibility of persecution and hardship for those who remain faithful. But it is also truthful about the guaranteed hope. The persecution and hardship will certainly give way to victory and vindication. See, Revelation describes the two sides warring for the fate of the entire universe, and each of us must choose sides. We must get off the fence. And John clearly tells us the fate of each of these sides so that we can make an informed choice in light of the two certain destinies. And then the final tool of Revelation is a big view of God, a theology of a great God. You see, in this book, God is not wimpy, surrendering control of his world to evil forces. But God is always in complete control, with the outcome never in doubt. Christ is the risen Lord, walking among his churches and watching over them. God is the Holy One, enthroned over all the universe, with angels bowing down before him. Christ is the slaughtered Lamb, who has decisively purchased his people and is worthy to bring our story to its appointed conclusion. And God is the just judge, who pours out his righteous punishment on all his enemies. And Christ is the mighty warrior who defeats the devil and even death itself with the word of his mouth. So the struggles we now see in the world are not an even fight between two equal sides, but it's the vain struggle of an already defeated enemy whose time is almost up. And therefore, the readers of Revelation should be encouraged and remain faithful to this great God. One of the common problems of the modern church is that our God is too small. What I mean is that our view of God is too small. We need to rediscover the greatness of the real God as he's revealed in the book of Revelation. We should not put our hope in anything else except God's goodness and his greatness. So now let's look at the methods for reading Revelation well. The first method is to keep Fee and Stewart's first rule in mind. They say that the first rule for reading the Bible is that the Bible cannot mean what it could not have meant to the first readers. In other words, if a suggested interpretation of Revelation would not have made sense to the people in John's day, then it's probably wrong. And forgetting this rule is the source of many problems. So be cautious about many modern popular treatments of Revelation that forget this rule and primarily try to fit the book of Revelation into current events. And be cautious about trying to fit the book of Revelation neatly into what we read in Matthew chapter 25 or 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. We're not sure that John's readers knew these passages, and John doesn't make explicit mention of them. So we risk distorting the book of Revelation if we try to force fit it into a preconceived scheme or into our own worldview or history. And the second method is to understand the symbolism. That means to understand what the first readers would have understood. And that often means some historical research. But more often, it means familiarity with the Old Testament background of Revelation. You see, most of the images in Revelation are taken directly from the Old Testament. If you want to understand the book of Revelation, know your Old Testament. Let me give you one example. In Revelation chapter 7, an angel is told to seal certain people on their forehead, to put a seal on their forehead. And this is making reference to what was narrated back in Ezekiel chapter 9. So if you want to understand what's happening in Revelation 7 better, read Ezekiel 9 and ask what connection the author makes and how what happened in Ezekiel informs what is being described in Revelation. Now, in many printed Bibles, there are cross-references in the margin that list related passages in the Bible, and many electronic Bibles have similar kinds of links. These are often helpful for researching any Bible passage, but they're especially important for Revelation. And it's usually worth your while to look up Old Testament references to help you understand a symbol that John was using, because he usually draws his symbols from the Old Testament. Now, to understand the symbols, make sure that you put them in their historical context, in the first century, not in our context. Just one example. In Revelation chapter 9, we see a vision of locusts like horses with women's hair, with stings in their tail. And some people have concluded that these refer to Apache helicopters. Well, probably not, because that wouldn't have made sense to the first readers. Much more likely, they referred to the Germanic barbarian hordes that were a constant threat to the Roman Empire at that time. And notice, some symbols are constant and some are fluid. Some symbols always refer to the same thing. For example, a beast coming out of the sea is always referring to a political empire, going back to the Old Testament and always in Revelation. However, some symbols change. We've already mentioned that a lamb is mixed with a lion, but both are referring to the same person with two different symbols. But in a different way, another example, there are a number of different symbolic women described in Revelation. Some of the women in Revelation describe something good, like the bride of Christ. But other women in Revelation symbolize something bad, like the great prostitute. So every woman in Revelation does not refer to the same kind of thing. You have to tell from the context, is this woman referring to a good thing, a bad thing, etc.? And some symbols are multi-layered, so that they can refer to historical realities, but also point to the spiritual realities that stand behind them. And most importantly, pay attention when John interprets his own images. Sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't. And sometimes he does, but not until chapters after the first time he introduced the symbol. But whenever the author does tell us the meaning of the symbol, that should serve as the certain starting point from which you interpret the symbol and all the other surrounding images. Then finally, see the visions as a whole and interpret the symbols within the context of the larger vision. And don't press the details farther than the author intended, like we talked about when we dealt with the parables. Now, the third method is to exercise caution in connecting the symbols to actual history. Like I said earlier, start with the time of the first readers and see what fits in their history. And then we can, very cautiously and humbly, ask if there are other situations in history that are analogous to the realities that Revelation describes. For instance, I would never dare to claim that so-and-so in history, or in modern, especially in modern times, I would not be so bold to say for sure that is who's being referred to by the beast or the false prophet, etc., described in Revelation. Sometimes I make a joke about Oprah, but that's just a joke. However, I wouldn't be totally comfortable saying that certain people or institutions throughout history have exhibited similar characteristics and therefore were likely under the influence of the same kind of spiritual forces. Because God's enemies have cropped up many times in history, including our own, with very similar strategies and methods. For instance, the way communist and Islamic governments always persecute the church is strikingly similar to the way that the Roman Empire persecuted the church. Now, we need to be tentative when we do this, and clear that this is not what Revelation is primarily talking about. We're just trying to apply what Revelation teaches to history, including our own. Because we're given no clues to match the pictures in Revelation to present realities. And even if this were so, we could only tell in hindsight, and then not for sure. So we should be very wary against this kind of approach. Now, some symbols and pictures are clearly about the end of the age and future realities, and should be taken as so. According to Revelation, faithful Christians have a lot to look forward to. But even these are just pictures, not detailed descriptions. The future for God's people will be better than anything that can be described by human words, even in the book of Revelation. Now, our future experience will not show that the description in Revelation is somehow mistaken or wrong, but it will show that the descriptions in Revelation were inadequate to fully tell about the way it will be. Remember, the purpose of Revelation is not to give a detailed roadmap of history, but rather to give encouragement for faithful disciples. So be tentative about how you connect Revelation to history until you have really good evidence through solid historical study. Then the fourth method is to keep your understanding of Revelation placed in its historical context. Keep in mind their real experience of suffering and martyrdom. For instance, in chapter 6, we see a vision of the souls of faithful martyrs crying out for God to avenge their unjust deaths. And they were told to be patient until the full number of those to be killed would be completed. So the book of Revelation is addressed to the challenge given by the violent Roman Empire determined to stamp out Christianity. But at the same time, it is a challenge to the Roman Empire. At the time when it seemed that Rome was undefeatable, John, writing from a Roman prison colony, leads his readers in rejoicing over the fall of all of God's enemies, including the Roman Empire. Talk about guts. Because this would have seemed ridiculous at the time. But in hindsight, the church is still here, and the Roman Empire is not. And Revelation is encouragement for God's people to be faithful, because God's kingdom will last far beyond any of his enemies. So Revelation is not for us to figure out and play mental games to try to solve the mystery. It is to strengthen the courage and resolve of real people in very difficult life situations. Keep that real life dynamic in mind. So let Revelation strengthen your courage and resolve, that you will be faithful to the Lord no matter what forces are fighting against you. Then the fifth method is to relate it to the gospel. See everything in the book of Revelation in light of what Jesus accomplished through his life, death, resurrection, and his present reigning as king over everything. In other words, Revelation tells about current and future events, even the second coming of Christ, but only in light of everything that happened in his first coming. Everything in Revelation is an application of the gospel. It is an outworking of what Christ has already accomplished. So try to see how every part of Revelation relates to what Christ has already done and how it is a proclamation of the gospel and its effects and application in all of history. And then the sixth method is to see everything in light of the main point. Again, Gordon Fee says, even though the church will experience suffering and death, it will be triumphant in Christ, who will judge his enemies and save his people. Remember, God is in full control of history, the past, the present, and the future. So he can be trusted, even in the most difficult situations. And we should resist every temptation to give up or to give in to God's enemies. So, if we go to Revelation like it's a crystal ball to tell us the future, or if we try to figure out who is the Antichrist or what is the mark of the beast, if we try to determine the times and seasons and yet don't immediately feel the challenge to stand strong, if we're not comforted that the worst that they can do is take our life because God always wins, if we major on the minors and miss the main point, then we've completely misunderstood the book of Revelation. And that brings us to the final method for reading Revelation well. And that is to take this message to heart and commit to be faithful to God no matter what. Prepare your heart now for anything that might happen in the future, because when it happens, it might be too late to prepare. Revelation calls God's people to faithfulness, even when it looks like the good guys are losing. Trust God in the good times and the bad, because he is a great God, sovereign over all history and all the universe. Okay? Now, typically I would give an example of interpreting each genre. But because this section is already getting long, I'm going to push that off to a supplementary section. So we will go through an example of how to interpret Revelation well. So check it out if you feel it will be helpful. But now let's review. The characteristics of Revelation are it is a prophetic, apocalyptic epistle written to encourage God's people to faithfulness and hope. And the tools of Revelation are the overall plot of victory the symbolic visions, the encouragements and warnings, and the theology of a big God. And the methods of revelation are keeping the first readers in mind, understanding the symbolism, cautiously connecting to history, placing it in its historical context, relating it to the gospel, and seeing everything in light of the main point, and applying it by remaining faithful to God. So that wraps up our discussion of how to study the book of Revelation. And that also completes our discussion of the genres we find in the New Testament. Next is that supplemental section giving an example of interpreting Revelation well. And in the section after that, we will begin to look at the genres we find in the Old Testament, beginning with Psalms. Thanks for watching.